Welcome to today's webinar, Advice from Adobe. Think big, start small, and iterate often. I'm joined today by Simi Bhargava, who is Adobe's Senior Manager of Data Governance. Simi and her colleague, Joe Wallace, will take you through their journey to data intelligence. We'll hear about their overall journey, including hitting some bumps in the road and how they adapted to keep moving forward. We are going to have questions and answers at the end of the presentation. With that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Simi and Joe, to begin the presentation. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, everybody. It's bright and early over here in the Pacific time zone. And I'm assuming, Angela, you're advancing the slides there? Perfect.
Yes, Simi, I am. We're just, I'll go actually here. There you go.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Let's see, how do we begin? Where did our Adobe journey begin, and how did we give birth to sort of the whole data governance concepts here? So some of you may have heard this, some of you may not. At the last Calibre conference, I talked a little bit on a panel about our journey, but I'm going to definitely get into it a lot more. And before I get started, I also wanted to introduce Joe Wallace, who's going to be joining me today. He's my data governance lead on my team. We have what I call a small but mighty team, and in the past 3.5 years or so since I've been at Adobe, I think we've given not only birth to data governance, but even to some respects a maturity model all the way up to Shantanu, who uses it in his keynotes at the tech summits and runs the Adobe business using a lot of the analytics dashboards we've produced about the customer journey with data governance embedded and built right into it. In fact, it's a model that's touted often at many of the customer visits that happen, and I've done many customer reviews and briefings kind of describing this very journey. So let's begin. And data governance at Adobe has been attempted many times in the past. And when I joined, the first thing I had to do was listen to a lot of people who had attempted it, who are very bright, sharp individuals, and understand what didn't work. Obviously, we learn a lot from successes, but the most you learn is from the failures. And believe you me, Joe is a relatively new member on my team, but I have been through probably more failures than anyone can imagine. And it's about believing in something and trust in data. It's about having confidence that the future is data, and every decision at a company is made through data, and thus the governance of that data and providing transparency, providing trust, providing confidence in that data, so the discussions are not revolving around, is the accuracy of this correct? What's the source of truth? Who's the one that's talking about it? What does it mean? But it's more about, let me free the data so that the data can be used to make insights, decisions, and actually move forward a business and give them a competitive advantage. So having that as my foundation, as our foundation, I didn't give up. And I think many people, when I joined for the first 6 months, kept asking me, why haven't you started a data governance council? Where's the forums? Why aren't you getting all these people with like minds across Adobe together to meet? My problem was, great, let's go meet, but what are we going to talk about? What are we solving? So I come from a very product management background. I come from a product thinking. Adobe also is a product company, and I really wanted to find a problem to go solve and embed data governance sort of in stealth mode into solving that problem, because I have a hypothesis that every problem you solve requires data, and data needs governing, but how do you embed data governance into solving those problems? And I think what happened is a perfect storm about 6 months in. Shantanu Ryan, who's our CEO, was in a meeting, and he was talking about, this is a weekly meeting that took place with his leadership team to talk about the Adobe business. And in that context, there were 3 different representatives there were about 5 organizations in this meeting, maybe even more, But in this particular instance, 3 organizations presented the same KPI and metric, and I'm sure this has happened in many of your organizations. And each of them had a different number, a different definition, a different meaning, and a different interpretation of why the number was what it was. At that point, I'll make this a little bit more animated, but at that point, Shantanu kind of threw up things, and things were in PowerPoints and they weren't in dashboards, or if they were in dashboards, they weren't aligning. We just said, all right, enough. Enough is enough. We got to get this problem resolved, guys. We can't have 3 different people coming to me who I respect tremendously, giving me 3 different numbers, 3 different answers to my questions. So there was the perfect storm. The problem statement we had was all these data silos which existed, and how do we get this fragmented reporting to help us determine our customer journey and drive the key KPIs in that customer journey and pull and stitch all of this together. As a result, that problem, I'm a part of the IDS team at Adobe, which is the Information Data Services team. We provide all analytics across all of Adobe, everywhere from product usage to the back office. And so being in this team and listening to kind of the problem statement, opportunity. And so I think the number one thing there, if you just, Angela, can go to the next slide, please. The number one there is, how do you leverage this data to create this customer journey that we were trying to do? Those are the stages: the discover, the try, the buy, you use, the renew. This didn't just happen, and this didn't just exist. When we started, all of this was broken, and the fundamental questions needed to be asked is, how do you bring 5 business units to align? What questions do you each need to answer about your customer's journey for what you and your organizations, whether you're marketing, sales, go-to-market, finance, what is it that you each care about? And we started with an English language question, and we told all 5 teams, all of you have 10 questions. What are your top 10 questions? And would you believe how many iterations it actually took for us to go through those, to explain to each other, well, what do you mean by successful campaign? Define success. What do you mean by, right? So I think don't underestimate the power of words. Words can mean many things. And even as I'm speaking, each of you will walk away with a slightly different interpretation, lens of how and what I said, right? Unless you explain and talk and ask me kind of, well, what do you mean by that? So really, that was the start of our business glossary, if you were. And obviously, on the shelf, we had a decision about Calibra for 2.5 years prior to my joining Adobe. And no one had made that decision because they couldn't quite find the right use case to go implement the solution, at which point I did make that decision, and we've been partnering with Calibra ever since. And that gave us a start to put all of these English translations into a data dictionary, into a language that can be shared across people. That also started the opportunity to basically, it's okay, Angela, you can go to the next slide if you wish. It's all good. So these were the types of questions that were being asked that couldn't get answered. And the sort of the center of the screen, as you see, were the different personas that we were working through. There were analysts, there were wranglers, there were data scientists. Ooh, that looks a little messed up there, but it's if you guys can read it, you know, it's executives. Data scientists and executives, those are kind of all the personas that existed and the types of questions you were trying to ask. And many of these people were producing the analytics across the KPIs I mentioned in that customer journey on the previous slide. What we ended up doing was creating about 10 KPIs or so when we started across that customer journey, assigning different owners, or otherwise known as business stewards, right? Sometimes language is really important, right? As I mentioned, the stewardship gave people aversion. Data governance was a 4-letter word. So stop using it. What's the big deal? Get your message across. Get what you're trying to fundamentally create and go do that is what we had to learn. And believe me, these are all the failures I'm talking through that I had to learn the hard way. Then alignment across 5 business organizations to agree on who owns which definitions, who produces the data. Oftentimes, the person who reports the metric isn't the one who produces the data. The data actually comes from downloads or usage or um, uh, the spend analytics comes from traffic and other things, right? Net new ARR is a financial metric, but how's it calculated? It's calculated based on billings and entitlements through a commerce system, which isn't often owned by finance. So just think those things through early, and it's okay to be wrong. Even today, I will tell you, I probably don't have the right business stewards and the right technical stewards assigned to the KPIs which run Adobe, but it's okay. We have someone who's raised their hand and said, I care, and I will be the go-to person to resolve any issues, to answer questions, etc., etc. So I think it's really important for you to establish definitions, ownership, stewardship, both technical and functional, and then sort of connect all of these into a repository that can be shared. And that is what became kind of the impetus for solving our problem at Adobe, and it was the perfect storm. The last thing I would say is know your environment. Remember what I said earlier about listen, listen, listen. If everybody's pushing you to go start something and you don't believe in it, you don't have to start it, or start it and learn from, well, see, this is why it didn't work. Now, some of you, the governance councils and those concepts work, and that's the culture. Please continue. I'm not saying don't or stop. I'm saying know your customers, know your culture, know your company, know what works and what doesn't in your environment. We're a product company. I'm of a product background. What works for me and at Adobe was coming up with what's the minimum viable product for data governance. Governance means many things, and Angela, please go ahead and advance to the next slide. Governance means many things in an organization, and depending on who you're speaking with, I guarantee you they would bring up one of these chiclets you see on the screen. Well, no, governance is compliance, governance is PIA, governance is GDPR, governance is definitions. But it's what's needed to solve the problem that Shantanu had described was what we needed to pull out of the definition and adapt it to what it means to Adobe. So we focused on the yellow highlighted chiclets you see there. And in some regards, we're still iterating a lot of this across the enterprise. We started with the consumer business, and now we're doing the same thing with the enterprise business, and almost data-driven operating model, DDOM, has become a verb, if you were, because now everyone across every function wants to run their journeys through a data-driven operating model because of the success we have achieved with this model for running the business. So think product. We thought minimum viable scope. We thought, what problem are you trying to solve? Who is the persona that you're trying to solve these problems for? So what and how do you solve it for each of them? And come up with, a few artifacts that you want to produce that'll help you stitch this together. And I'm going to turn this over to Joe. And Joe actually was one of those people that I mentioned in the 5 teams who was a part of the business. So the ultimate success, and believe me, I've been through multiple data governance leads and members in my team, and it has not been an easy journey. But what I've done and have been able to do successfully is convert many of them to become champions of data governance who continue on at Adobe and continue to sort of drive that original vision and journey. And that's what you're trying to create. Don't get too attached. Create people who think like you, because most governance organizations, data governance organizations in a company are relatively small. So Joe is a prime example, and I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'll let him describe the naysayer he once was about data governance and what he thought and how he was converted to become not only an adopter and implementer, a success, but then also became the lead for data governance on our team. Joe?
Thanks, Simi. So you can go to the next one, Angela, that's fine. So my background, I was in ACS, which is Adobe Customer Success, and I was the man for all of the data. We did all the analytics, we built all the dashboards, we did all that work. And I am super lazy, and I didn't want to continue having to just churn out dashboards and churn out things constantly. So my idea was, let's build a database that anyone can access, which is like Xanadu, right? The problem with that was everyone was taking that data and consuming it in different ways. They would take ARR or bookings or whatever, report it in one place. Someone else would do something very similar, report it differently, and we just had this nightmare, right? So Simi noted that nightmare and came to me and said, well, what about governance? What would you think of putting in some governance? And initially, I thought, well, I didn't know what governance was really, and I sort of thought, when you say governance, people's eyes tend to roll in the back of their heads, and they don't really understand what you're trying to do. Once we got into the weeds and said, look, we're going to define these things, you're going to own those, you'll be accountable for them, people will know that you are the person to speak to about different things, blah, blah, blah. That's when it really clicked. And we implemented governance, and we used Calibra really heavily, and they still do, to be able to identify these things. And so to me, that taught me a few things now that I'm in this role. The first one is to gain traction, you got to break down the silos. Well, philosophically, no one has a governance problem within their own silo because they're defining things within themselves, and that's great. It works out perfectly. But once you start owning data and using data that goes across multiple functions, multiple BUs, multiple whatever, that's when you start getting into these things. And what you have are these conversations between these executives saying, I want it this way, and someone else saying, I want it this way, and the businesses don't talk. You have to break those down to be able to present the solution to a broader issue. Ultimately, we're trying to represent different KPIs and numbers to the street, right? In order to do that, you have to have common definitions. And in order to do that, you have to break down those silos. And what I've found is generally people are very, very glad to have these conversations, to have someone pushing these conversations forward. So that's the first one. The next one is getting skin in the game. It's a balance between the carrot and the stick. On the one hand, you're using the carrot of Xanadu, everything is defined, you have accountability, you have lineage, you have all these things. At the same time, you have to have someone to give you those things. You need the most likely, at least for me, I didn't know. I didn't know the answer. So I needed to go find them. And so finding people who are leaning in, finding people who understand, who see the vision, and who can start putting these things together, giving you the information you need to give them the carrot to keep dangling that out there so they keep on going, is really important. And so, there are a few different ways. With Simi, she appealed to my competitive spirit, and she kept pitting me against someone else. She go, well, this team, they've done all these things, and I would say, well, I don't want them to beat me. I want to do that. There are people like that in your company and in your organization. I guarantee it. And when you present when you present the vision of what data governance can be, really start getting a lot of traction. And that's what's happened at Adobe in the past several months. We've really gotten a lot of traction. No one says no to governance. They only say no to how to get the governance in. And so that's where you have to start engaging with the stewards and the champions equally, because it's those people on the ground, it's those grassroots people who are going to actually do that work. And those are the people you also have to engage with to really make any progress. Go to the next one, please, Angela. Thank you. So ultimately, what is that carrot? What are we selling? What are we giving to the business? Data governance really sits between those producers and the consumers. And this is where Calibra has been an incredible product for us. Being able to put and connect the people who are producing the data, who oftentimes don't even know who's consuming it at the end. And the people consuming it at the end, the executives or analysts, don't really know who's producing the data. They just know they have data. So what Calibra has helped us do is, one, build out a catalog of data. So anyone now at Adobe can search our data catalog, can find assets, can find who's accountable for that asset, people, definition, KPI, whatever. They all have names on them. And the other really powerful part of Calibra is enabling the communication upstream and downstream, because that's what we've found, and that's our current battle is how in the world are we going to connect these two people? And that's through lineage. And so what we've been doing is we've been really working with technical teams and all these other teams to put lineage, the data lineage into Calibra. So you can say, this data comes from this system, it starts here, then it goes to this system, then this system, then this system. And you can connect all those people and say, this person owns that system and blah, blah, blah. And this is where it gets super cool is when something upstream is going to change, they can put a notification. And then everyone downstream and everyone who cares about a specific KPI will get that notification. And in some cases, you can have it be that they have to approve that communication. So it is really, really powerful. And to make the data consumable, trusted, and searchable is really our mission. And in order to do that, we need to sit between those producers and those consumers. And Calibra has been incredibly helpful in that.
Great, thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
And I think, actually, Angela, just to say 1 second on that previous slide, I think the only other thing I wanted to, a couple of things just to reiterate. In that story that I described to you, the 5 teams, right? There were people across those 5 organizations. Some kind of folded their hands and sat back. Some kind of leaned in. And actually, believe it or not, we needed that lean in. And at first, we struggled and tried so hard to get all 5 teams to be equal weight and gave them all equal power and control to make decisions. We realized, again, through another mistake, that not everybody is equal. And people who are leaning in, step in and get them to become the drivers, get them to become the champions, showcase them. And that may mean that a particular function gets more of what they want versus the others. But had the others leaned in, they would have been more influential in the prioritization of what got implemented, delivered, and for who and how, right? So I think that was the part where Joe was describing pitting him against the other team was those 2 teams leaned in and now have come miles on the maturity curve of implementing a lot of data governance and have created these champions and stewards within the business functions themselves. So I think that is very important. And then the second thing is, guys, don't take away from this that everything is hunka-dory. The next set of things, this is that MVP concept I was talking about, the minimum viable product, right? This was what we chose to be a part of our minimum viable product. We have a huge road ahead of us on the lineage that Joe just described and really completing that. Why do I care? Data lineage matters because producers and consumers in all the hops and transformations the data goes through from raw to structured is all about SLAs, compliance. It's about, did the hop actually work? It's all about data quality. Trust comes from quality built in from the time the data is produced all the way through the hops it takes to get to the consumers. So the same conversation now, every week Shantanu has that meeting, and the conversation is no longer about the definition or the accuracy or who. The definition is clear, who owns it is clear, who talks about it is clear. The conversation has shifted to what levers we can move and push around. However, we still have a hurdle on the trusted part that we're working through as we iterate those KPIs. Okay, Angela, please go ahead and move on to this. So what are the key takeaways? Really, ultimately, as mentioned, find a nice business problem in your organization to solve, folks. The best way to solve it, it doesn't have to be something as big as this was with our perfect storm from the top down. It ended up being just the perfect storm, as I said. Any problem, if you're having a lot of CSOs or customer service outages on a particular part of the business, go dig deeper and understand. If your CIO is frustrated with a problem, or the director of sales needs some efficiency target met and it's not happening, or the payments in your commerce system are failing, go find a person who cares about the solving of a problem and see how you can embed data governance into solving that problem. because ultimately it's all about the data from producers to consumers and that chain of command, right? Next slide, Angela. Data governance should become a part of that solution. It isn't something that you have to call out explicitly, separately. Use language and artifacts and build capabilities like a business glossary. Build capabilities like roles and responsibilities of who should care and what a steward actually means. Who defines something? Who maintains something? When there's a change in that calculation, how are we going to get everyone who cares about that definition or that change to be notified? Those are all governance concepts, but you're not calling them governance concepts. So I think that's really important as part of this as well. Oftentimes, a data pipeline and the reduction and the problems in the data pipeline are often a challenge in many organizations. Well, believe it or not, that's completely a data governance problem, but we don't have to call it that. You can call it reducing cycle times, improving SLAs, fixing the hops of data to make sure that they're actually making it from point A to point B to point C to point D. Next slide. And little did we know way back when we started, and if you guys are familiar with Gartner, you can take a look and search Gartner's adaptive data governance. That's the new name. When you try and solve a problem and you specifically pick and choose, because the scope of what you're trying to solve in data governance is very important to help identify. At Adobe, we still struggle with what exactly am I governing? Because once something becomes sticky and people see the value and they start seeing, oh, this is awesome. Well, we have a whole self-service user community that we serve in our data services team that is kind of free for all right now. But to govern 27 petabytes of data is not a simple task to take on, and or nor based on the risk profile should it be taken on. So adaptive governance is really all about finding and defining what's your scope, finding a balance between the carrot and the stick. And the stick, do not dismiss, right? Sometimes you can use PIA and PII and just GDPR or other compliance initiatives to help you be the stick from data governance perspective. But I think you got to find that balance between that problem and solution. Next slide. And then I had to be reminded, and I actually learned this from one of my peers of the user group from Calibra. I've developed a little relationship with some of the other customers of Calibra. And it was a really good reminder. We tend to be, because I'm in analytics and because I'm on that team, we tend to be analysis paralysis people, right? Something has to be completely perfect before we can call it done. No, it doesn't. Having small successes and celebrating those small successes, having opportunity to recognize your business partners, your user community, anyone who has stepped in and above or leaned in, and recognizing them, sort of touting the successes is really important. And it helps others kind of feel like Joe just talked about, well, why are you talking about them so much? And they did this, this, and this. I want to do that too. How do I get on this bandwagon, right? So definitely do that. And I'm still learning from my failures, and I still continue to fail day in and day out. Sometimes looking at the decks I produce to sell the vision or pitch or whatever, depending on who that persona or audience is, ask Joe. I mean, there's about 30 different versions I have, and I try and I try, and I keep reinventing myself almost every quarter, I would say. What am I trying to do again now? Okay, how can I get that message across? And so don't give up. Just continue to learn from the failures, iterate, and don't give up, because data governance is one of the hardest problems in my career. And I've had a long career, believe you me, in solving problems. This is one tough challenge, but I think it's the future of many companies and organizations that are struggling with this. So if you can master a few key concepts and take some learnings from what we've described and apply it, you're going to become a very, very wanted candidate in the industry. Last slide, Angela. All right, so what is this? Think big, start small, iterate often. I didn't say it enough throughout the presentation, but Angela and the rest of my team knows me because that's my tagline on my signature. Have a nice big vision. Think big. Don't think small because you'll never achieve kind of the milestones along the way. Celebrate them. Iterate, iterate, iterate. I am not kidding you. I iterate and reinvent all the time. And then start solving and a little problem at a time, right? So I think that's really the motto. And ultimately, if you do this right, if adaptive governance gets done correctly, back to the problem I described, the discussion around the table is a hour and 45-minute meeting every Monday morning where data is populated across that customer journey across all 5 business silos now with clarity on definition, ownership, stewardship, working on quality as well, but much of it is there. We've retired KPIs, added new KPIs. It's skin in the game from the business from beginning to end. Shantanu attends those meetings. He's blown away at the language that's used and how everybody understands each other. And the focus is on how do we pull the levers to change the number that they're seeing on the screen, if it's dropped or if it's gone south or if it's for a particular region. By doing that, by building this all in, what you've just done is you've freed the data. Data is now being used the way it needs to be used, and more our future, and I'll leave this for a future talk perhaps, is when you free the data, you enable many of the users across your organization to use the assets that you've certified to do their own thinking and their own building and their own solutioning. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Simi and Joe. That was really interesting, and thank you for sharing all of your learnings as you continue on your journey to data intelligence. I will close out this. I just want to cover off on a few things Calibra oriented as a part of this conversation. I think this slide it really aligns to what Simi and Joe were talking about within the analytics organization at Adobe, but many of our customers, and just from a report from IDC, 69% of organizations say they struggle to turn data into useful insight. And I think we heard from both Simi and Joe how they took that customer journey and they actually brought governance and visibility and collaboration and confidence to how they leverage the data within Adobe to be able to bring visibility to that customer journey and confidence to what everyone across those 5 different silos were seeing. I think we talked about this from I think Adobe talked about this a lot in terms of their data challenges and really thinking through a new approach to this. So most organizations that we work with have these same data challenges. So data quality and inconsistencies of the data. I think probably one of the biggest challenges is finding and accessing that data. I know most organizations, and Cindy hit on this, have concerns around regulatory and compliance of the data that's being used throughout their organizations, being able to standardize that, and just having a complex data environment. Adobe talked about the 5 different siloed business units and bringing that information together in a collaborative way. But the impact to the business, from these challenges is just being able to, and I think we heard this from Adobe, just a lot of time wasted on non-value added activities. Not being able to have that data-driven organization to leverage that data to compete, to innovate, and to grow the organization. And just that collaboration being impeded by the misalignment. So I think these challenges were really what Simi and Joe were talking about as they began their journey to data intelligence. So for Calibra, being able to have this data intelligence platform where you can have real-time compliant access to the trustworthy data and being able to provide that data, the right data with the right context to the right user to build this collaboration across both technical and business users to be able to set that using Simi's terminology, which I really love, is to set that data free, or in other words, to democratize that data so that people can have the confidence to use that in a data-driven business model. And what Calibra strives to do is to be that system of record for data intelligence. So most chief data officers and organizations need a system of record, just like the CRO or the chief marketing officer has Salesforce to be able to be that system of record. The chief information officer has a platform like ServiceNow. Chief digital or chief data officers have a platform like Calibra to be able to be that collaborative platform throughout the different organizations and different systems that they want to be able to provide to their organization. And what Calibra does is really enable the enterprise to turn that data into value, which is what we heard Adobe just share with us, to be able to automate those critical data processes. I think we heard both Joe and Simi say that Calibra was the collaborative platform between the business and what they call the producers. So we're close that collaborative gap between those two constituencies within the organization. But by doing that, we increase the speed, the quality, and the confidence in the decision making. And I think Adobe shared that those KPIs that their CEO Shantu looks at on a weekly basis, there's no more arguing about where did that data come from. It's about what levers can they look at to move their business forward, and help people understand how to use that data, and more importantly, how not to use that data. But creating the shared understanding and getting that buy-in. I think they use the term lean in across the organization to come together to automate those critical data processes and be able to have that trust. I know Adobe spoke about that the trust is an ongoing and iterative journey for them, but by ensuring that the data is accurate and consistent and secure, and that it aligns with the strategic priorities. So what are we looking at in terms of key performance indicators to run our business, and give that transparency to the complex processing. Adobe talked about the lineage of that data and how important that is in enabling the trust of their data catalog and enabling that communication throughout the organization, whether it's the notifications or the approvals, etc. But really helping people answer the who, the what, the when, and where is that data coming from. And then really to unlock the value of that data within an organization. We heard Adobe talk about improving their SLAs. Well, that's lowering or that's improving their operational efficiency to be able to look at how to drive more revenue or how to improve that customer journey for Adobe clients. But turning that data into valuable information and then gaining those user insights and the intelligence from the underlying data, and aligning that data strategy with the overall mission and goal of the organization. And once again, connecting the right data to the right process and to the right people. So these are some of the primary benefits of Calibra, is that we are built for the business users. I think it's very important to have that collaborative platform between the technical and the business stewards, or in Adobe terminology, the business and the producers. But we're really designed to democratize data intelligence for non-technical users. So getting the business on board is hugely important in terms of the adaptability of the platform. So our UI is designed for that business adoption and for that collaborative effort within an organization. And taking a holistic platform approach, Calibra is a tightly integrated platform so that we can deliver not only governance, but the catalog that Adobe talked about, but also privacy and risk, whether it's regulatory, as Adobe mentioned with GDPR, but there's CCPA and other regulatory requirements that continue to face our customers, and be able to have that common platform foundation with flexible integration and operability approaches as well, And then operate at scale with machine learning, being able to leverage machine learning models to learn from user input. That increases the efficiency and being able to automate data classification and that guided stewardship. Leveraging machine learning is a huge advantage to the Calibra platform. And then obviously we work with enterprise size organizations, so having that enterprise grade flexibility is a key differentiator and a primary benefit of Calibra. We talked a bit about, I think Adobe talked about being able to adopt this data-driven business model in their organization, but having the federated operating model and the flexibility of our operating model ensures that the business can take their current approach, or in Adobe's case, this data-driven business model approach, and be able to implement that throughout their organization, and then have the flexibility to customize, the workflows and or create custom workflows. Joe talked about being able to put notifications and be able to have those approvals. Really was a foundational component to enabling that communication throughout Adobe. And this is what Calibra helps to facilitate. And finally, just once again, being able to have business value. So we saw with Adobe just the improvements that they were able to achieve within their organization and how the operational efficiencies and improved SLAs that they achieved. But these are some of the other return on investment that our clients are seeing. You can see a client had a 510% 3-year ROI from their investment in Calibra. A lot of other operational efficiencies in terms of less time to locate data and reports, and knowing that they're certified and trusted. 28% lower frequency on data-related errors, and then just improvement in gross productivity by business intelligence and data organizations throughout the organization. And with that, Stephanie, we're able to achieve greater understanding, which gives our customers greater opportunities to focus on things that are truly going to drive their business forward. And with that, Stephanie, I'll turn it back over to you. I know we've got questions from the attendees, so I will turn it over to you to present those questions.
Yes, we do have a few different questions for Simi and Joe. Starting with, how many instances of Calibra do you have? For example, development, test, production, and how are you maintaining these environments with respect to user access and migrating new solutions for end users in production?
So I can take that. So if there's anything I missed, please keep me honest. We have two. We have a pre-prod and a prod instance, and we use the obviously the cloud model of Calibra. And how do we keep the users in sync and most? In all due respect, we really have most of our user community, the consumers and producers, both business stewards, technical stewards, using the production instance. Rarely do we have them coming into our pre-prod environment. The pre-prod environment I generally keep pretty locked down to just the technical teams who are testing, say, the new data catalog or a new product. We've been looking at a lot of tools for data lineage, for example. SQL dep is a POC we did on our pre-prod instance. So we try and keep the two very independent of each other. A lot of our users, the other thing you have to understand is Calibra, sorry, I'm going to be very honest, but one of the things you have to understand, again, is your user community. So we have a bunch of users who are really power users, and some of them will go into Calibra to do a lot of their sign-offs and acceptances, or the workflow, basically, to accept definitions or agree and align on definitions through the workflow we've set up. But most users, we push the data to the surfaces they live in through the APIs that Calibra provides. So for example, the dashboard that I've been speaking of in this meeting, we have an integration that we've built that links to that dashboard, and people hover over a simple metric or KPI and can get the definition, steward, and any other attribute we want to push. So we do not force anyone at Adobe to go log into Calibra, yet they have access to it.
Great, thank you. Another question came in. How do you identify and choose new projects to work with respect to time, resources, and business impact? What are your selection criteria?
So it's interesting. We do an annual planning intake process, and it's all kind of tied to budgets and projects and funding, and we do M&A projects, and we are going through this exercise, so I can kind of off the top of my head tell you we're not picking projects for governance. We pick projects based on, well, sometimes we do, depending on compliance, security, data lifecycle management, things like that are projects we've picked this year that we want to zoom in on. But what capabilities of data governance do we want to mature, and for what scope of data assets we want to build those for? That's kind of how we decide. But we really let the businesses that I talked about of Adobe help us. What are the must-dos? Must-dos could be if Adobe's done an acquisition, you've got to bring in the systems and processes, because those organizations now will also use the same KPIs to help run their business. So even if you may end up with 2 instances of a back office application, the data that gets pulled from all of those and it gets aligned to those dashboards that run Adobe has to align. So that's how you kind of pick some of them, is through M&A. Those have to get done. The mandate sort of projects that are cross-functional at the CIO level or at executive level, our CTO. The others are basically must-dos that the business wants to add new, say, route to markets into the selling process. Or they want to, right now we've been doing, for example, the mobile part of our business is manually calculated for ARR, but we want to automate that so that we eliminate any inaccuracies in that pipeline of route to market. So that's another example. So must-dos that are more driven by where we want to go. If you recall in my presentation, I subtly spoke about not being in the business of doing all full service analytics and freeing the data to allow the business to actually use the assets that are certified we've produced to go do their own analytics. So that is a big play for us, and we prioritize a lot across our team to do self-service analytics, and are building a product to allow our users to actually have that product, have data governance, data quality, scheduling, standard ingress, egress type of architecture standards built into the product itself. So that's one play that we have prioritized. And then after that, it's really business priorities. What is it that's deemed, depending on the part of your business? And we try and have iterated over the years to have lists that the business executives produce to help us determine what do we go work on. And in each of those, there's a component, especially for data governance, that gets impacted. Now, as I mentioned, I have a very small and mighty team, so the only way I can scale is to build those playbooks, build those processes, build those, how you do things, and make it really simple, and let the teams who build these applications do data governance themselves. So that's kind of how we prioritize. I hope that helped answer the question.
Great, thank you, Simi. Another question is, since this is an evolving plan, what are your next steps on the journey?
I alluded to it. I just spoke to one of them. One of them is, how do I get out of the business of, so we have 3 delivery models. We have full service, where we have Scrum teams that do delivery of all dashboards, all the way from ingestion all the way through producing a dashboard. We have co-development teams where we provide sort of a center of excellence of leadership in architecture, in development, and in sort of data governance sort of leadership. But the Scrum team is actually the business led, and product management or requirements are directly the business. So we're teaching them how to fish, but we're still providing that sort of hand-holding. And then the last model is completely self-service, right? So we have 3 different delivery models across our organization. And dang it, I knew I would do this. What was the question again, Angela?
The question was the next steps on the journey.
Okay, so that was one. So one is really just, how do we provide a tool that can eliminate and provide governance? Because the least mature governance is on our self-service. And data quality was another one that I provided as I spoke, that we're embarking on a journey of the trust in data and providing through the data pipeline different SLAs that we have to meet in order for a business to run like clockwork. All the data assets and data producers have to provide the data in a timely manner to produce that KPI and metric, right? So Sunday mornings is when we have to get 44 metrics on one of the most used by 1,500 plus people and run that meeting with Shantanu Monday mornings. It needs to be ready. And if even one piece breaks in that, right? What broke? What does it do to the metric? Should we be looking at it? How do we use it? Etc. So that is our next journey, I would say, is the data quality. And what are the measures? What are the proactive ways in which we can notify the business that there's a problem versus the reactive way, which is, hey, this metric looks off a little bit. What's going on here? Or this is a seasonal metric. Usually in December, this should be higher than it is. Well, how do you build that in from the get-go so you're not facing that after the fact? So data quality, self-service, and maturing the data governance there are probably, and then are probably our two biggest next journey steps.
Can I just quickly add one little thing? The governance journey and next steps on all those things is always dependent on people. You generally work in sort of, or at least we do, in a more of a technical engineering based field and with those types of people. But the battle is always there of getting people on board, because governance is only as good as the people who are putting information into Calibra, as the stewards, as the org champions. It's only as good as the people. And so, my motto is always be selling. I'm always out there trying to find new people, trying to get new people involved. And that battle doesn't end. It's a continuous thing of trying to get more people into Calibra, their eyes on it, and using it. That's another sort of arm of what Simi had said.
Thanks, Joe.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Another more specific question here. What tools or software are Adobe using to support Lineage?
So right now, our biggest tool is a guy named Rajat who sits in Noida. We're having build. I know that's funny. We're building relationships with different vendors. Calibra's helped us out, pointed us to a few different places. We're looking at SQL Depth, a few other things to try and automate that lineage. But right now, it's a very manual exercise.
Yeah, I mean, we've attempted many things because we have most of our data lands in a Hadoop data lake for us. So we've even looked at Navigator. We've looked at a lot of solutions. We've looked at custom solutions, you name it. And then the other thing that is interesting that you have to solve, I have in the last 3.5 years not been able to solve the automated data lineage problem, if that answers the question. If anybody else has ideas, I'm open to them. Please reach out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It looks like that's all that we have time for today. Thank you everyone for joining. Again, we will be sending out the recording for this webinar to everyone who attended today. Thank you, Simi, thank you, Joe, and thank you, Angela, for your presentations.